Up or down?
I want it off.
Oh.
I'm going to introduce the speakers in reverse order. Anne Jacquard, who's the organisational secretary for the Marxist-Humanist Initiative. I should be practising saying that, I'm sorry. It's a bit of a mouthful. The details of their website are on the emails that you no doubt got, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And Andrew Kleiman is at the back, the author of some of their fascinating books, which are worth reading, and as I've found, very difficult to understand, and are worth pursuing and struggling with. And I think that's the point that Anne is probably going to get to as the third speaker. To struggle with your own thoughts is the reason why we're here today, I think. Jack Dean has been involved in Housing Action Southwark for a number of years and probably be known to several of you, and produces the Occupied Times. But the first speaker is Ravi, who's a film star and now part of Dorchester Court Resists, which is what DC resists rather than the comic, and the struggle he's got on his hands most immediately is trying to keep a roof over his head and that of several people he lives with. Ravi.
Okay, thanks Ian. There's a reason I kind of wanted this platform of speakers, because I'm involved in both the MHI and HASL, which is Housing Action Southwark and Lambeth. And I'll start off by telling you a talk I did last year at the Radical Housing Network conference in November, where in my introductory talk I tried to explain how the housing crisis could not be understood except as an aspect of the broader economic crisis, the crisis of capitalism. And I went on to explain why only through having an anti-capitalist approach to housing campaigning would we be able to fight the things that housing campaigners actually focus on. And so I may as well put it up front that I don't think the housing question, as in how do we achieve decent housing for all, can be resolved except through a struggle to create a new society. That's not to say that we can not have temporary gains or that we will not be able to in the here and now get immediate victories, but as a sustained long-term goal that everyone can have decent housing, I don't think that can be achieved under capitalism. So I'm going to, in this, focus on why arguing for something like specifically having more council houses built and for the state to play a greater role in providing the things that people need doesn't really get to the heart of the problem as to why capitalism can't deliver it for everyone. And the case for revolution is often thought of by those who understand it and who do understand it as the transformation of society rather than just going around shooting people you don't like. If you avoid that caricature and you do understand that it's the transformation of the conditions of life, then it's kind of regarded as a nice idea that's never going to happen. And it is a really, really difficult thing to conceive of in some ways, because people know that this society doesn't work and it doesn't meet their aspirations, but the achievement of something completely different, they find it hard to imagine as possible to achieve. And then there may be objective barriers, despite the fact that the vast majority of people may benefit from it, but the achievement of it is seen as just fantastic and unrealistic. Now, this society runs on the acceptance by the majority of working people whose efforts create the system that we live in, but also at the same time denies those people what they need to live fulfilled lives. Without that kind of acceptance by that kind of majority that allow this society to function, it could not work in the way that it does. And if working people are going to remake society, they have to be organised around ideas that will allow them to make it happen. And in order to do that, it's not enough to struggle against the system, as people will be forced to do anyway, there has to be a vision of what we would replace it with and what it would take in order to bring that about. Now, MHI was founded on the belief that we need Marxist revolutionary philosophy to make that happen. Because once workers have understood that Marx's vision in relation to how it relates to their conditions of life and to their circumstances, once they've grasped that and how that vision of a different way of life can be related to their own direct circumstances, they then have the ammunition to be able to change the world. That's what the MHI are founded on. And rather than having a division between an objective set of circumstances which are insurmountable and yet a subjective sense of this is wrong, it recognises that the subjective element in this thing is actually an element and a moment within the objective process. So we have to see that it is our thoughts and ideas as it informs our actions that shape the world. And just with that very simple insight, you think, oh, okay, in the abstract that sounds great, but what does it actually mean? It means that the people who allow society to function, they have to be the ones that also recognise that if they pull the plug and decide to reorganise society, then nothing can stop them. And it's the fact that we are denied what we need to live full and fulfilled lives that means that we have an interest in doing it. So it's not just activists or theoreticians that are going to lead people to do these things, but people themselves, the vast majority in society, have to grasp the ideas that allow them to see that they themselves are going to be the ones that take control. Which leads me to why I like Hassel, because I came across them before I met the MHI, but there was already something about them that I liked as well, and in the approach that they do, which is that they don't try to do things for people, but they try and work with people to get the things that they need. So they do, one of the things that really impressed me was that they've got a real insistence on working with migrants. That's a lot of the people they deal with. And I think this is gone, hasn't it? No. There's a real sense in which migrants are treated as part of the working population, and rather than being just okay. So rather than seeing them as foreigners who've got their own peculiar problems, they're dealt with as human beings with like specific needs that have to be met. And it's that kind of internationalism and anti-racism that Hassel have shown right from the start, from when I met them, that immediately drew me to them. And the fact that they try and work on the basis of what people want to do themselves, rather than telling them what they should do and trying to kind of corral them into various activities, they consult with people themselves as a way of, getting the things that people need. So we recently did a protest at the housing office for this lady who has been forced to travel from where she'd been moved out of the borough to bring her kid to school, who was still in Lambeth. And we went down to the housing office en masse, and one of the things that really stood out was after we'd been there and we were getting quite a lot of pressure to leave, and the organiser of it just turned around to the woman who was at the centre of it and said, "How do you feel now? What is it you want to do?" And it was that allowing them to determine the actions that were taken that it is quite important. What I would like to be able to do, and ideally the kind of combination that I would strive to see happen in the future, is the insights that I've learned from MHI be adopted in the work that I do with Hassel. Because what doesn't happen with Hassel yet, and I'm not quite sure how to make it happen, is that the aspirations and demands that people have got as to how they want to live their lives becomes the starting point and the sort of take-off point for making that the property of the working class more broadly. Because if you can show the links between the demands that like the poorest people and the most disadvantaged have and show why they have got common interest with everybody else to fight for decent things, you've got the possibility of creating real solidarity there. It's a difficult thing to do because migrants in this country aren't viewed that favourably, and to win the argument is going to be a difficult one, but I think it's one that needs to be undertaken, and we can't shy away from it really. But you know, I'm fairly confident that Hassel might be up for it. It's just going to be a lot of work, and leave it at that.
Does it ruin the filming if I don't use this? Because I
No, actually, it's better
just,
without, I'll be honest, actually.
Um,
There's a humming, if you just turns it up.
Oh yeah, it's there. Turn it off.
I've turned it off. It's in the speakers itself.
Yeah, the speakers, yeah. Can we just get in there?
Yeah, I'll let you have it. Yeah.
The humming, yeah.
So yeah, hi, I'm Jack. I'm part of Housing Action Southwark and Lambeth 2 Hassel, where I met Ravi actually. I think what's probably useful is to sort of add to a little bit to what he said. He's obviously set a great foundation. I think personally, obviously, revolutionary change is something I'm interested in, but obviously not just around necessarily the notions of class, but also sort of the necessity of ending white supremacy, decolonising the whole of society, and also the patriarchal stuff that just flows through the entire housing crisis, because it's very much primarily violence against women as well. So I've been involved in Hassel for about 2-3 years, which about 6 months after it had started, and we're just a group of local residents that have started with the position that a decent home for all is just a basic necessity of life, so there's no need to compromise on that logic. So what obviously then happens is you set about working on the challenges that are between you and that goal, and very quickly through the organising we did, we found that the state was a primary mediator of all of this, and the state is racist and the state hates women, so straight away we started supporting each other through our lives, and we have regular meetings where people can bring problems to the group that they've got with their immediate housing concerns. We organise training sessions together based on gaps that we find in our legal knowledge or so on, so that we can learn what our rights are together. We host regular lunch clubs where we get local donated food, we sit and cook together, and we spend the afternoon together just enjoying each other's lives in something that to many gazers might not seem political, but is intensely political because it allows experiences to be shared in a way that isn't necessarily this kind of format, for instance, and it gives a different kind of scope for sharing antagonisms together. And then we do actions together based on demands that the group kind of concocts. They can be individual tiny actions, such as the one that Ravi mentioned, for instance, where someone in the group is unhappy with their situation, so we figure out together what we can do to militate those that are denying that access to those resources, to give the resources that we need. And sometimes those actions begin to kind of collect together into larger campaigns, both of which in Lambeth and Southwark can be kind of sort of pulled under the umbrella of what we call gatekeeping, which is where there is already inadequate but legal provision for housing, but instead of following the law, councils use violence and lies and obfuscation to deny people access to that service. And that turns the housing offices in both boroughs into incredibly horrible places that have almost entirely escaped the gaze of the entire left. And what happens is someone will turn up, they are statutorily homeless and are in legislative need of emergency accommodation. Instead of the council welcoming that, doing their job and so on, they will either assault the person as they try to enter the office by security guards. If they manage to get further than that, they will then be shouted at and abused by the receptionist. So at that point, either one of those will lie to them and say there's nothing they can do to help, they just need to go away. They will say things like go to the local library, they'll help you out. If they get lucky enough to get into the door, they might have to wait for the whole day to see someone who will then lie to them again or just turn them away. If they do see someone, then they will be again lied to, they will be harassed, abused, usually with racist and kind of classist terms thrown in by workers. What will then happen is a tiny minority might get the housing they require, But the rest are basically thrown back to the street. Sometimes they're literally street homeless, sometimes they're with children who are left with nowhere to go. And that's the basic day-to-day operations of housing officers in our two boroughs. And that effectively has become where we think the housing crisis is happening, because that has been happening for decades, ever since someone somewhere or something decided that social housing was going to be unnecessary in the long term. They began disinvesting in it about 20, 30 years ago, so conditions have worsened, houses aren't being built, so if you've got people applying for housing and you've got legislation that would put them in housing, obviously you need to start to cook the books effectively, to turn people away and so on. And so that's become one of our major campaigns in both boroughs. In Southwark it's impossible for us to do our work at the moment because around these things, because if you're known as a member of the group, they basically lock the office in the middle of the day and turn you away. They don't just do that to us, they do that to, that's one of their tactics of anyone that's difficult. They'll use collective punishment. So, as you can imagine, in boroughs like Southwark and Lambeth, primarily the people affected by this are black women. Quite often they're migrant women as well. Quite often they're caring for children, which in some ways does help secure housing, but is basically obviously a huge issue. And so the day-to-day work is trying to reverse those relations, trying to stop people being thrown out of housing office, to stop people being thrown out of their boroughs, and to support them in getting those things done. So we, in Southwark at the moment, are working on a ridiculous pledge that we want to get Southwark Council to sign up to, which literally says we'll follow the law as one of their things. I mean, that's really where we are. And so that's the kind of, the day-to-day reproduction of the group is all around that kind of thing. But obviously that's such a compromised position to where we want to be, because we recognise that if everyone is dealt with via legislation, that's still inadequate, that's still racist, that's still classist, that's still all the things. But that's how you begin to change the way things work. That's how, instead of viewing revolution, say, as some moment in history that erupts, which it can do, you change social relations by changing social relations. So, in the simplest terms, if people are being thrown out of the borough, which is causing gentrification, then you reverse that by stopping people being thrown out of the borough and stopping gentrification. That's not enough, but that's how you begin to walk back down the road together of creating a situation where with every victory you build collective power, with every victory you learn knowledge which you can share with each other, and eventually we start getting the council to listen. They already do listen more than they used to people now, that when they know they've got hassle supporting each other, they won't do the same things, and it does make a difference. In the broader sense, I think there's definitely a housing movement growing in London, but I think it's still completely failed to actually acknowledge the white supremacy running through, especially what's going on in South London, and it very much has not cottoned onto the violence against women, and in fact what I increasingly term as a kind of extension of domestic abuse, because one of the main things that really gets to you is you hear and we meet women that are trying to escape their abusive partners that will turn up at the housing office and they're literally sent home that night. And I don't think you can separate the two situations from each other. I think that's broadening the concept of domestic abuse and it being actually used by the state as a disciplinary mechanism. So I think both of those things are very much missing from what's going on in the housing movement. I know Sisters Uncut, a local group that organised specifically against cuts to domestic violence services, are connecting these things, but there doesn't seem to be a tendency to have connected that with the broader housing crisis and the stuff that's going on under all of that. I think as well there's a failure to recognise that migration raids that happen in South London and policing in South London are not outside of these processes. The housing crisis didn't just start from nowhere, it starts from a process of making those that have migrated from colonial heartlands to here to perhaps chase the wealth that was stolen from them, making places as inhospitable to them as possible. So you can't fight for housing without challenging racist policing, and you can't fight for housing without doing as much as possible to disrupt border raids. And the two the two are very much about going alongside a place which makes it inhospitable to be in the area. It's about pushing people out because it's the last perhaps remaining source of value that remains in this city, is to just find this land and do what he's doing with it and so on. So I think those are the kind of major overarching things that I'd like to see. I'd also sort of point out that even in this country especially, there's a historical problem with the kind of definition of solidarity that a lot of the larger unions work on. When I've been talking about all of these workers, a lot of them are unionised workers specifically, and so that they're members of Unison. And we were rather shocked when we'd been documenting all of this abuse and sort of from criminal to just unlawful behaviour, that the response from a local union was to ask us to stop documenting this and to leave their workers alone. Which is an interesting concept of solidarity. And in fact, one confrontation we had outside Southwark Housing Office, where I actually confronted the branch secretary that had done this and asked her why she'd taken this approach, when obviously we'd pointed out unlawful activity, and surely even a union that's sort of like locked in certain institutional logics can challenge unlawful activity and support their members and so on. And instead she just told me to get a job. So that is also a part of it. I'm not having a go at anyone that's in a union. I'm not making this personal, but as a structure, they're also a challenge that, as we found, needs to be overcome in the kind of march to housing justice and so on. And I think that's my rant over.
You said 10 minutes, and that's exactly what I did.
Okay.
Okay, they both spoke very short, and I want to speak long, but I hope, I'd like to hear a lot more from them about what they're
Absolutely.
doing.
Come
I
back
think
with
it's
questions,
fascinating, so I hope you'll ask all of us questions, and that we'll have a lot more discussion, and that I feel bad going long, but I had to cut half of what I wrote, so you can ask me questions too. I want to thank the Radical Housing Network for inviting me to speak about the relationship between theory and activism. I've been grappling with that relationship for over 50 years, and I will tell you some of my history and ideas. I live in New York City, but I was in Spain last week, and first I want to report that the movement of housing occupations and eviction resistance that was so tremendous in Spain over the last 10 years is still continuing. The Indignados movement, I think you know something about, that started and before the world financial crisis, and resisted the horrible things that happened in Spain. In other words, the unemployment, the poverty. They have not recovered from the financial crisis, the world crisis, the way some other advanced countries have. Anyway, the good news is that the housing movement is still continuing in Barcelona, Madrid, and elsewhere today. The gaining of a little electoral power by Podemos, the political party that largely supplanted the Indignados movement, has not even begun to solve the housing crisis there. It's able to do nothing and may not want to do anything, who knows. I was struck by how similar the battle for housing in New York, Madrid, and London are. All three cities have rising rents and severe shortages of decent low-income housing. The working class and middle class are being priced out of their homes and urban renewed out of the cities, while the unemployed are increasingly sleeping in the streets. There are 60,000 homeless in the Madrid streets alone. What I find astounding is that the burst of grassroots movements against this trend. Tenants and poor homeowners all over the world are fighting to save and improve their housing and to get more built and to get some control over their shelter and their neighborhoods. Most astounding is the similar themes I've heard among the ideas coming out of the growing movements. People are putting forward the idea that housing is a human right, that housing is not only a necessity of life, but an extension of what it means to be human, and certainly what it means to create one's future, to forge a good life. Last week in Spain, a young woman who had spent some time camped out in Madrid's Plaza del Sol during the mass protests there described to me the flowering of discussions and the feeling that remaking class society was possible, that anything was possible. We hear this revolutionary sentiment from the South African shack dwellers movement to the homeless camps in Los Angeles, in the US. And I'd love to quote them all, but I don't think I have enough time. Let me tell you a little about my more than 50 years experience in the US housing movement and other grassroots movements, and about the theoretic context for my activities, the theoretic context that developed along with the activity. I first became involved with groups of tenants who organized themselves in poor neighborhoods of New York City in the New York 60s. The massive African-American civil rights movement had moved north, where it took the form of fighting de facto segregation in schools, employment, and housing. In the Puerto Rican neighborhoods where I was first active, we students worked with the tenants in each small building who organized themselves, invited us to come along, and then the building's tenants associations formed block associations, and then those formed neighborhood associations, and finally citywide organizations. Bed sheets proclaiming rent strike hung out the windows of every building in poor and middle class neighborhoods all over New York. No renta para ratones. The movement forced landlords to repair buildings. They stopped evictions. They obtained some enforcement of existing building code and rent and eviction controls, and got some laws improved. That movement is where I first learned about the deep thinking, creativity, and steadfastness of ordinary working and unemployed people. You experienced what it means to be part of so big and profound a movement that you foresee the possibility of uprooting capitalist society. The civil rights movement also inspired other movements of the 60s and 70s, the student and anti-Vietnam War movements and the women's liberation movement, each one coming along and adding more layers to the concept of what human freedom means. I was an activist in all of them, so my conclusions apply not only to the housing movement. What made the civil rights movement and its extension in the New York City housing movement great was not only Black people's demands to be treated as full citizens, but the projection of blacks and whites together through their joint actions, becoming citizens of a very different society from the one we lived in. The call was never only for integration or only for better jobs, housing, and schools, but also for the transformation of how people live and of relations among people. The goal was a society in which the free development of each person is the condition for the free development of all, whether or not these people knew that formulation, which is by Karl Marx. They knew the idea. And like the recent Spanish grassroots movements, the civil rights movement's massiveness and projection of a different future, the force and the ideas together, created a new relationship between theory and activity on the ground. But we did not have the needed social and economic revolution then or since. Most white youth of my generation dropped out of revolutionary work. What was missing? I came to learn about Marxist-Humanism and to conclude that Marxist philosophy of revolution is also a force for revolution, a part of the process toward social transformation when it intertwines with the activity of the masses. What happened to me was that I met up with Marxist-Humanism and the philosopher who developed it for much of the last century, Raya Donevskaya. 10 years earlier, before I became involved, she had founded the philosophy she called Marxist-Humanism on the basis of her studies of Marx and Hegel and her experiences with workers, women, African Americans, and youth in the US. She saw the need to make Marx live and concrete for today, her day, to stop his being hijacked by so-called communists like in the Soviet Union. Marxist-Humanism considers it imperative not to wait until, quote, after the revolution, to begin working out what creating a post-capitalist society entails. Not a plan, but to work out thought for their future control of work, housing, and everything else. They build a new society. In order to break down the division between thinking and activity, Donevskaya engaged workers and activists in every stage of developing theory. She went to West Virginia and talked with the striking miners about Marx. She listened and heard them expressing his ideas, that is, asking what kind of work should human beings do. Because workers think their own thoughts and express their rejection of this society so profoundly, our age, she said, and I think it still is experiencing a movement from practice, from the grassroots, that it is itself a form of theory. That is, mass movements that not only reject what exists, but also articulate what they are for. So my involvement with Marxist humanism was never separate from my activity with in relation to grassroots movements. I became a tenant lawyer 40-some years ago in order to have a job and to have one that maybe helped people a little. I had no illusion that my work could substitute for that of a mass grassroots movement. In fact, most of my career I have felt like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike trying to stop the flood of evictions. When I started in the 1970s, there were almost no tenant lawyers. Large rent strikes were still going on, the kind I've described from the 60s. And the city and state had responded to the movement by, they were forced to have some government-regulated programs that allowed tenants to have a little something. So they created sweat equity co-ops where a group could get a little dilapidated building if they would fix it up and bring it up to code all at their own expense, and then they could have it. Those were tiny but interesting. But the state also built some large estates of regulated low-income housing with some small element of tenant control of them. And in those places, the spirit of the grassroots movements remained for another decade or so. I remember walking through a big project, we call them projects, your council housing, where my firm represented the tenant directors of this place. And there was not a bit of vandalism nor even graffiti on the walls as there was everywhere else in New York City at that time. Among those tenants, the drive to control their housing was permitted until it wasn't. When they fought too hard against rent increases, the government regulators cracked down and us lawyers litigated against the regulators' decisions and had to get the tenants out of jail when they sat in the regulator's office. But of course, we couldn't win much. So it went with other changes in the law. Each victory was followed by big real estate successful efforts to undo any improvements. And I could describe some of the laws to you if any of you were interested, because you're fighting for changes in the law. I could tell you what happened with the ones we got that never worked. Right, like tenants could petition to take over and run a dilapidated building, and they could then collect the rents and use them for repairs. The problem was the buildings were so run down that you couldn't make the needed repairs just from current rents. The landlord was off with all the rent he'd collected and not put in the building, and there you were stuck. And today, and we've had rent controls since World War II. We didn't take them off. But today the rent regulation is so complex that neither tenants nor landlords can figure out what the legal rent is. And so landlords get to raise the rent to whatever they want by default. Very hard to find out if you should fight it. The limitations of changing laws are pretty obvious. I've also been involved in many other movements in the U.S. So many anti-war movements, Vietnam through the Gulf War, through Iraq and Afghanistan. been involved in many labor strikes, continuing movements against racism, now Black Lives Matter, which echoes the civil rights movement's call for a just society, movements against imperialism, dictatorships, and apartheid, and have been very involved in the development of women's liberation movements in the U.S. and around the world, and in solidarity movements with third world liberation movements. In every grassroots movement, housing and otherwise, I always emphasize that the reforms we are demanding probably cannot be won, or if won, will be taken away again as soon as possible, as soon as our the people who don't want to give us anything regroup. It's important that we talk about this and be prepared for defeat rather than to be devastated by it and not then give up. We have a very big critique of Occupy Wall Street because they went merrily along once they were evicted from the square. They said, all right, we'll have another demonstration today and then we'll have one in that part of town tomorrow and blah, blah, blah. You know, they didn't stop and say, we've got to figure out, you know, whether it was a good idea or what went wrong or what we should do next. You can't just keep doing the same thing that didn't work. Shouldn't be surprised that the first thing you try doesn't work, but then you can't just keep repeating it without any thought. Or, as I say, you can be devastated and give up. But the point of these movements, even when they're small, and all of our movements are small, I mean, I think what you're doing here is terrific, you know, but they're small, right? They're not, you know, 100,000 people in the street or barging into that council housing office. But the reason to work with them and encourage them is to hope to reach new levels of activity and ideas that can form the basis for the next movement that develops. Marxist-Humanist wants to help movements to grow in strength and confidence in their ideas and to begin to prepare for the day when people can begin to control the society. Because I think that working people are the ones who can remake society, and they need to practice taking control of it now, I've tried to work with housing groups run by local people, not by activists from the outside, and to work with groups who draw their ideas and plans from the people who live in the housing, not just making up things to do out of the activists' heads. The groups I've worked with were not trying to lead the members of the tenants groups, but to assist them. Another continuous area of activity throughout my life has been international solidarity with Latin American and many other grassroots groups. And the principle is the same as working with workers and poor. In this country, we always try to establish people-to-people relations, not just to go and appeal to our government to put pressure on their government to stop slaughtering the rebellious peasants or whoever it was. We would search out and find from the refugees who we were working with, people who'd had to flee to the U.S., we found youth, women, and indigenous movements with whom we could communicate, and they would express their goals to control their lives, and we, that is Marxist-Humanist Initiative's predecessors, we publicized this to the U.S. public in order to raise money and send aid to them. I worked with a lot of Chilean political refugees during the military dictatorship in the 70s and 80s in Chile. And we sent money to a neighborhood youth soccer club, which I knew very little about, except that they weren't just playing soccer. You know, they were working to bring down the dictatorship. More recently, from within the carnage caused by the U.S. war in Iraq and Afghanistan, I've done support for grassroots movements fighting against both U.S. war and occupation and fighting their own oppressive regimes, particularly on issues of women's and workers' rights. Can you tell me how much time
You've got 5
left?
minutes easily.
5?
Yeah,
That's
fine.
it?
Yeah,
Well, I'm
you're
only on
okay.
page 4.
Yeah.
Okay. Done support work for the Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq. That's one of the groups. For the Revolutionary Association of Women in Afghanistan. Incredible women, incredibly brave, risking their lives every day to get women into shelters so they're not killed by their husbands or families, and starting newspapers and radio stations. And in Iraq, OFI has actually been going to areas that were controlled by ISIS and rescuing women, women who were enslaved there as sexual slaves by ISIS, and they've been trying to grab some of them out of there. We have had trouble, though, convincing the leadership of the U.S. anti-war movement to discuss these things, to publicize and help these grassroots organizations because of the lousy politics of the American left, in which they wanted to limit anti-war discussion to just talking about U.S. imperialism and how evil that was. And it is, but that doesn't mean that you don't also fight the enemy within each country, the rulers right there on the scene, and still on the scene in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. Marxist-Humanist initiatives practices international solidarity the same way we practice U.S. activism, by listening to the grassroots, finding out who's talking about liberation, drawing out their ideas, offering our own, and having an ongoing exchange. We don't try to tell grassroots movements what to do. We do discuss Marxism and Marx's vision of the future as the standpoint from which to measure our work. Are we doing things that are taking us in the general direction, not a program or revolution, but things that foster people's development of ideas about how to reorganize society? We need to be clear when we speak to our fellows and sisters in the housing movement that we will at best win small improvements. We can't win control of housing for the many. Ravi spoke about this. Capitalist economies are not going to provide low-cost, nice housing unless they're forced to, and that means we need the downfall of capitalism to get it. Occupying homes cannot bring down capitalism by itself the way withholding labor can. If everybody in the world went on strike, we'd get rid of capitalism in a flash. But all grassroots housing occupations survive at the discretion of the rulers, as Occupy Wall Street learned. Sure, you can have that little park, until we say you can't. People need to be not surprised at defeats. I said this already.
That's 3 minutes there.
Okay. Okay, I'm skipping some more. Let me see. Another thing I've learned to be keenly aware of is the Hegelian principle of transformation into opposite. Any movement can be transformed when its leaders are bought off or whatever. And this is particularly common, I've found, over the decades in the housing movement, where some smart owners or government officials would say, okay, tenants group, we're sick of you agitating, you take over and run this dilapidated building or set of buildings. And it's a trap because you don't have the money to fix it up, and then you become the one that has to collect the rent from your fellow comrade tenants, and then you become the oppressor, just like the owner. So we've seen that happen in that movement as well as others. The housing movement has grown all around the U.S. in the last 10 years, especially since the housing bubble and economic crisis of 2007-08 caused so many people to lose their homes. Sure you've heard about the outrageous mortgages that made people lose houses, the renters who lost their jobs and so were evicted, etc. We've had campaigns to stop evictions, stop gentrification, save neighborhoods, build low-income housing, impose rent and eviction controls. These struggles have very much intensified. And in addition, there are some quite new creative forms, such as occupying vacant housing, rehabbing it, and moving in homeless families, and defending camps of the homeless. This is a big issue in Los Angeles. Never mind the movies. People live there in the streets because it's warm enough to live outside, and have built huge encampments, and the city has outlawed it and is trying to tear them down, and the housing movement is defending them. There's beginning to be some awareness in U.S. culture that eviction is a major social problem. There's a recent book entitled Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. The author Matthew Desmond argues that evictions are the dominant recurrent events in the lives of poor black women and children. That evictions are comparable in their devastation to women and children, comparable to the high rate of imprisonments, devastation of black men in America. In New York City, the most urgent fight now by neighborhood organizations is to get low-income housing built and maintained. Currently, the waiting list for public council housing has 270,000 names on it, and they represent 500,000 people. Right, because it's more than one per person in the household. A poll last month found that 2/3 of New York City residents, 2/3, fear being priced out of their apartments or neighborhoods in the next few years. Our supposedly leftist mayor has made a proposal to build some housing, but the houses he wants to build are not affordable by low-income workers. I think you have to have like an income of $51,000 a year, which is not a high income in New York City because, you know, everything's high there, but it's certainly not something obtainable by most of the low-income workers, the minimum wage workers in the fast food industry, for example, who are largely Latino and black.
Can you sum up?
Am I at the end?
Yeah, we can come back with other things.
Okay. Yeah, I have a whole section I'll save for later.
Save the
Which,
goodies for later.
uh-huh.
Save the goodies for later, yeah.
Well, I'm just telling you in case you want to ask me about it, otherwise I won't. But I went through and critiqued some of the theories going around, other than Marxist-Humanist theory, to talk about the housing crisis, and I think it's of interest, so I'll try to find a way to come back to it. Sorry
Thank
for
you.
not being able to keep time.
Just to get things going, and I'll ask some questions, invite questions in a minute. Some things just struck me as you were speaking, the three of you, and maybe I don't want you to answer this. It's not in the form of a question, but maybe late, as you're coming back to other people's questions, maybe you can answer these. You, Anne, mentioned housing as a human right, which obviously for a lawyer is critically important. The UN says housing is a human right. I don't see the UN sending its blue hats and tanks into Britain to make sure that everybody gets houses. So is that just a mythic piece of legalese that we shouldn't be using? Housing is not a right. You talked about housing duty, which is the role of the local authority. The housing department in a local authority has a duty. Gentrification was a word invented in 1964. Today, it seems to me that local authorities are actively the developer of their own estates. So not only do they want to get rid of the duty, they want to get their hands on the revenue that comes from redeveloping their estates. Maybe you can think about that because that's beyond just not fulfilling their duty. That's connivance with themselves as the planning authority. And you, Ravi, started off basically saying that we are the makers of history. That's a paraphrase that is right. That history is made in the present. The housing question, the first Marxist piece of writing that I can know of, think of, is Engels' 3 essays in 1872 on the housing question, which was a year after the Prussians had destroyed the Paris Commune, and he was lecturing the Prussian socialists on how owner-occupation wasn't going to be a utopia in Prussia. Now that's 1872, so the housing question has been asked repeatedly. What's different about history now? That I don't think for a second you're asking us to go back and just read 1872's housing question and think that's going to be enough. Has anybody got questions? Comments? More comments? Yeah. And it's probably best to shout because these microphones, or answers, yeah. These microphones are not very good, so please shout up. Arms in here?
It's just the first thing that comes to mind, to be honest with you. I've listened as attentively as I can to everything, and the thing that somehow, I don't know why, but we don't know all the reasons why for a lot of things anyway, the thing that sticks in my memory at the moment is Jack at the end, who I've met before in various locations and situations, and he talks about people sharing antagonisms. He talks about activists in meetings sharing antagonisms. I find that a curious statement because there is something, I would say, unresolvable about, in essence, I believe, in the idea of sharing antagonisms. Because when you have an antagonism, you have an immediate schism. You have a breakage. And you have a unity, an inherent unity is broken into two. So if people are going to share antagonisms, what needs to foment or be created out of those, if you like, I don't know, Manichaean diametrics of antagonisms, is some sort of shared unity and a shared goal. There has to be a unity, and the wonderful lady in the middle who's done many years of activism. Yes, we will fall again and again and again and again, but perhaps eventually all this fractionalization of this dream of unity can actually reach a point of criticality, an absolute point of criticality, where the great fragmented pane of glass, if you like to use a metaphor, can eventually sort of melt and then fuse into a oneness, which can be the oneness of all people operating together in a beautiful unity. That's a great utopian dream.
Are you a poet?
A little bit.
Okay. Good man. Man at the back, I think you were leaning forwards in a quizzing.
Me?
Yeah. No? I've got a question.
I didn't have my hand up.
Well, nobody's got their hand up, so I'm going to come to you.
Okay, people generally think of theory as, okay, it's a guide to action to what to do. But you engaged it and others engaged. The problem we face is we have movements, they meet a barrier, and then people get disillusioned and demoralized. How can theory help us with that problem?
I just had my hand up because I don't like awkward silences, but I will kind of ask something then really. I'm surprised that not more people have talked about this issue of private property, because I think going back to what Ravi was saying, looking for a fulcrum to try and combine people's perhaps political analyses that they've come to prior to doing direct action or getting involved in grassroots campaigns. I can't speak for everyone in Hassel, but I know that for me, I always see this kind of issue over private property and all the relations that come out of that, how the state kind of institutes itself, how these other kind of relations, social relations come out of that too. And someone once said to me, well, why are you fighting for housing? Because that's not where the struggle is. The struggle needs to be with the workers, which is a very orthodox kind of view to take. But I actually see the fight for housing, and you know, it's kind of inherently, in Hassel at least, against this idea of private property, landlordism and that kind of thing. But it allows us to open up the doors for a lot more conversations with people about how the property form is kind of a bad thing in and of itself, to kind of open up these other conversations and new ideas that we can have. I'm not saying to talk about a utopia. I don't always think that utopian kind of visions are helpful when people are struggling to survive, because a lot of people that come to Hassel, they probably might not think that this is the type of society I want. They just need to think about how to put a roof over their heads really, and feed their kids. But private property has also been a really useful thing to talk to people about who are perhaps new to kind of articulating politics in Hassel, because a lot of people tend to agree with you that private property is a bad thing, and then trying to understand the nature and the relationships of private property is a good launch pad really for people.
My name's Floyd. I mean,
Floyd,
yeah.
Sorry.
Of council house building, all the rest of it and stuff. There was a housing crisis, but nonetheless it was kept to a manageable level. Now what we're seeing is that certainly over the last 2 years or so, housing, if you like, has become an issue for the majority of the mainstream political parties. For example, and also in the mainstream media as well. Along with that, there has been talk of, as you just mentioned actually, talk about the nature of private property, which I think is extraordinary because of course private property is one of the cornerstones of capitalism, and for even sections of, albeit the liberal section of the ruling class, to actually start to talk about it, and whether they do something about it is something else, but at least they are to talk about it. So I think it's extraordinary. You then can't separate that from gentrification, because of course you then have to talk about, well, who owns what and where do people live. And as we've seen, in terms of gentrification, that can be a two-edged sword. It can lead to an area becoming more vibrant and dynamic. It can stop it from becoming stagnant. It can also lead to the hell of hipsterism as well. So I think we need to look at, like I say, both of those. But certainly, I think the issue of housing, and why all of a sudden that even sections of the ruling class are talking about it and talking about it seriously, is, I think, an important question to consider.
Aren't hipsters tenants?
Well, a number of them, yes, are, but a number of them also, though, tend to be part of the rentier class as well. In terms of they tend to rent out their lofts and all the rest of it. So usually to other hipsters with neck tattoos and ridiculous bikes.
I'm not sure I can follow that.
No, don't try.
Yeah. I'll admit to being a complete novice in this area. I really appreciate the contributions this evening because it's drawn out some of the depth and possibilities for me. But one of the concerns I have, trying to get some sense of this issue in historical sweep, frequently the housing crises seem to have been come out of particularly periods of war and destruction in a number of situations. Thinking of today, the destruction that we've seen in Gaza, Syria, to an extent in Ukraine, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the consequent flows of migrants and refugees from those situations in search of, in desperation, because life has become impossible, in search for new places where it is possible to live. And then I was thinking back to when, in other situations, the post-World War I housing crisis in, say, Austria, when a whole social movement of cheap build housing, squatting, takeover of land and self-build projects. I'm a graphic designer, so Otto Neurath, the isotype guy, that was his founding experience, trying to, if you like, propagandize around the sheer numbers involved and the sheer scale of need. But then I was thinking about, okay, when has this been addressed on a large scale in terms of provision? And I'm thinking of the massive housing projects, post-Second World War, for instance, and the state in those situations was often, here in Britain, the Homes for Heroes, sort of patriotic state socialist perspective. What you seem to be arguing from a grassroots point of view, and certainly the experience you seem to be articulating, is the state is significantly part of the problem as we confront it today, both in terms of generating the mass destruction which has driven millions of refugees from their homelands to search for new possibilities, but also this resistance with the enormous wealth in Europe to actually make a provision that goes anywhere towards meeting the need. Now, and many people from the traditional left will immediately start making demands that the state bill and start a massive housing building programme to address this problem on an infrastructural terms. I'm part of a political movement which has continually criticised the lack of investment in many areas of social need, and in this current political anti-working class austerity period, I see no movement moving in that direction in terms of any significant state provision. I know there are discussions around taking place, attribution of responsibility for this, but for me there's a huge gap in terms of the realism of actually addressing this, and my gut instinct is, self-build, self-activity has a potential, but the bigger scheme of things demands concerted, organised responses where we force governments and major resources to be committed to this. And I can't see my way through to putting these elements together in a way that we can make some political progress.
Gentleman there.
Sorry if that was incoherent.
That's fine.
I'd like to go off that if I can.
Knock
It's
yourself
a
out.
similar. I think it's a similar issue, or it may not be. I'm not sure if I've worked this out fully in my own head. But my question is maybe, I don't know, it's not directed to anyone in particular, but I'm not even sure if it's a question. But essentially, the gap between grassroots movements, or people taking control of their own lives, their own their own course of life, essentially, how to chart their own progression of living. So, in essence, direct democracy. How do you square the circle between that and the current state or lack of internationalism in Europe, say? Or I mean, I can't remember who exactly in the panel said it, but was it you, Ravi? I can't remember. But someone said how migrants aren't viewed very positively in this country currently. I mean, I don't know. I haven't talked to a lot of people on the streets about this issue, but certainly from the media that I watch, from home, or the propaganda peddled by media outlets, that's the impression that I get. So how it currently seems like if you just let people go with their gut instinct, it seems that their gut instincts, well, not the majority of the UK, but let's say a subset, would go with a anti-migrant stance or a anti...
Too many people taking in all the jobs and houses.
Yeah, it's simplified, essentially. Yeah. But I don't know how to get around that. Essentially, how would you solve that? Would simply talking to them, getting different points of view out there, would that solve the issue? I'm not sure. I don't know.
I think it's a particular moment we're in where the issue of immigration is impacting straight into the housing question, which is quite astonishing, really. The gentleman there in the red.
No, it's just,
you're just waving.
Following the contribution with my own thoughts.
You were just waving.
Yeah.
Just waving.
And we'd like to respond.
Come back.
We'd like to respond, because I can't write that fast.